Welcome to the Elaborate Topics podcast, where we focus on lab-specific strategies for medical laboratory professionals. We're proud to be the healthcare detectives that work behind the scenes to get the results needed to influence medical decisions. Let's grow together and jump right into the lab.
Welcome to Elaborate Topics. We are your hosts, Tywauna Wilson, Lona Small, and Stephanie Whitehead. We're so excited to talk with you on this particular show. We're excited about the opportunity to talk all things medical laboratory. And we have a very exciting show for you for today. It's all about knowledge sharing. So when we decided we were going to talk about knowledge sharing, I did a little bit of research. So by definition, by dictionary, it says knowledge sharing is a deliberate, get that, deliberate exchange of information that helps with agility and growth between people, between families, between communities and organizations. So it's that active sharing of information, that deliberate active sharing of information between people, between colleagues. So when we think about that in the scope of our medical laboratories, we think about that knowledge transfer. And so it caused me to dig a little deeper, thinking about knowledge specifically. Okay, when we talk about knowledge, so that we are all on the same page, what are we even talking about in regards to knowledge? And so I found that there were like three key that knowledge falls into. You have your explicit knowledge, where this knowledge is readily articulated, stored, codified, is easily transmitted to others. And so this is the information that we have in our textbooks, we have in our procedures, we have in encyclopedia. It's information that's easily able to go from person to person, is documented, it's able to go from colleague to colleague. You then also have your implicit knowledge, which is that knowledge that is difficult to transfer from person to person, especially in means of writing it down or verbalizing it. And so one example that you can think of for implicit knowledge would be facial recognition. So we know faces, right? So when we meet somebody, we know their face, we know what they look like, but we really can't explain to somebody how we know what somebody else looks like or how we are able to recognize somebody's face. That's kind of more so of an implicit knowledge. You know the information, but you really can't articulate it well of how you know it or why you know it. And then there's also embedded knowledge, and this knowledge is shared through clearly delineated products, processes, or routines. So when you think about embedded knowledge, it could be in the form of management training, scenario planning and debriefing, structured ways of getting this information from point A to point B. So when you think about your up-and-coming leaders in the laboratory, your supervisors, your lead techs, and when you have lead tech meetings, when you have manager meetings, and you are deliberately giving that information from the lead tech to manager, or manager to manager, or whatever the case may be. And so it kind of put into context a little bit about this whole knowledge sharing ideal and this knowledge sharing concept as it relates to the laboratory, because as we know, knowledge sharing in the lab can be difficult, especially when things are not wrote down. Stephanie, what's your experience with knowledge sharing, and why have you found it to be important in the lab?
So thank you, Tawana. Obviously, I think our profession is going through an apparent workforce shortage, and we're all acutely aware of that when you're working in a laboratory, when we have vacancies. You know, we're finding that they're harder to fill each time. And there's a couple of different reasons for that I'll go into, but I found a quote by Dr. Winnie Schmeling, and it really summarizes knowledge sharing in a good way. It says, the systematic approach of making sure everyone knows what the best of us knows. And I felt like that was so fitting for our profession, because we all have those superstar techs. We all have those informal leaders, those lead techs those techs that might have been in our laboratories for an extended amount of time, and they know all the instruments, all the maintenance, they know all the procedures, all the processes. When things go down, they know how to fix them. And so we really start to rely and overly depend on those techs. There's some stats from an ASCLS source. It is a little dated. It's from 2018, but I'll put the link to the article in the show notes below. But basically it goes through some of the statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And in our profession, we talked about this a couple of shows ago, that we call our profession many different things. And so depending on what state or what laboratory you're working in or what environment you're working in, we may be called medical laboratory scientists or clinical laboratory scientists or medical technologists. And from a data standpoint, it has been difficult nationally to really get hardcore data on what is the workforce shortage in our profession. And so I think ASCLS did a really good job in this article kind of summarizing where we stand as a profession. But I'll give you a couple of stats from this article. It went through talking about like I said, the Bureau of Labor Statistics projected a nationwide need of an average of 13% of medical laboratory scientists and technologists. And not just technologists and lab scientists, they also talked about the growing need for lab managers. You know, when we have lab manager or lab supervisor vacancies in the laboratory, how there isn't that immediate pipeline of individuals to readily replace them. There's several factors that can drive or that are driving, I'll say, our workforce shortage. And I think immediately the top two are, you know, the retiring workforce. We have some very experienced technologists that may be working in our laboratory that are either retiring or planning to retire. And so in your laboratory, think about how are you gearing up to replace the wealth of knowledge that is planning or will be exiting your department. I know in our laboratory, we've got techs that have worked in our laboratory for exceeding 30 years. In our laboratory, we did have the most tenured employee in the health system, and she had worked in the laboratory for over 50 years. And, you know, how can you, you know, replace that easily? It's impossible without a plan in place. This also impacts, and, you know, it's something we don't readily think about it, but it also impacts our education program. So the retiring professors, instructors, assistant professors, lecturers, et cetera, how are we working to replace that educational need in our CLS programs and keep our CLS programs strong and vibrating and relevant across the country? Really, it's our profession trying to keep up with the demand in healthcare. There's, you know, exceeding population growth. There's increase in different demands of testing, like genetic testing. Genetic testing is really growing leaps and bounds. I think some reports say genetic testing is growing up to 15% or more annually. And so how do we keep up with that demand in testing while still trying to find experienced techs in our laboratory? Another area of the laboratory that is growing at a fantastic rate is point-of-care testing. And with all of the point-of-care testing that is being implemented, that adds different applications of compliance and oversight to the laboratory. So with those projected increases in the need of medical laboratory scientists, either for techs or management role, the profession suffers by not maintaining long-term employees in our profession. So, you know, in my experience, our profession is one of the major professions that really gain a lot from knowledge sharing, and even if you want to take that a step further and talk about cross-training or creating cross-functional jobs, just understanding all of the processes in the laboratory helps as a tool and a tactic to protect us from those vacancies. It gives us a pipeline of capable staff that we can put into roles or vacancies. It creates intellectual wealth. And to me, you know, that's one of the things that protects us, like we said, as we go through different pandemics. So if we even, you know, try to drive it back home to COVID-19, Lona did an excellent podcast last week. If you didn't catch it, go back and catch it and go back and listen to it on the care model for change management. And, it's really easy to make swift changes when everybody understands everybody's role in the laboratory. And so sharing knowledge and having a mechanism to maintain that sharing knowledge, I think really makes us better and makes us more equipped as things come down the pipeline. Tywauna, I really like what you said about the embedded knowledge and the implicit knowledge, because there's a management model that actually talks about the 70-20-10 rule. And basically, in summarizing, what that means is when a person leaves, they take with them probably 10% of what they take with them is knowledge that they learned from school and all of those things that, I guess if you want to say everybody's replaceable, that can be replaced because many of us have the same certification and we have the same basic laboratory knowledge. But 70% of what they will be taking with them is that tribal knowledge, like Tywauna said, that embedded and implicit knowledge that you can only gain from, being in a facility, working in an area, understanding who is in the org chart, understanding the instruments and the inner workings of that department. And 70% of that will leave when those people vacate, either for voluntary turnover or for retirement. I know you guys work in some very powerful positions and some very, great laboratories. So how have you guys utilized knowledge sharing to help combat the shortage in the workforce?
So, Stephanie, I just started, for me, just listening to what you said about that 70% of knowledge that could potentially just leave the workforce, and that was not just knowledge gained from, what they learned in school. That's a bit scary just thinking about that. And just hearing that, I just thought of a quote from one of my mentors that said that when two heads come together, you actually end up with this third head. And that's why it's so important to not only have people working in silo, gaining that embedded and implicit knowledge, and it's just that one person. But what if that would be shared? What if we shared that? It would be really powerful. I think when I think about, I know for us, sometimes we really get a lot out of just sitting down and getting our work done and just getting it over with. But if we can come together and share this knowledge or empower each other or start thinking in terms of collaborating and teamwork, it's going to make a big, big difference. And I was just thinking, if we think of each employee as this valuable person, not only the person that's running the instrument, this is the person with the expertise, this is the person that I give this responsibility to do all the maintenance, calibration, validation, and nobody else, this is their baby, and so nobody else will even understand what goes on because there's just that one person. And I think when they gain that knowledge just because they spend the time to do the work. It's based on experience. It's based on exposure. It's just like a hunch. When you have a hunch that something is happening, you don't know where you got that information coming in your brain, but it's based on a culmination of years of experience that would cause you to make good decisions. So that one person that is that special person that's taking care of that instrument, they would be able to make better decisions because they're exposed. But what if we expose more people to that kind of information? Then we'll have this powerful team. It's more about empowering and having this great team versus just having one or two people who know, this special person who knows this instrument. And so I start thinking of just different strategies that we could use. And when I think about it, it starts with the basic strategy. And as Tywauna said, it starts with just basic information sharing, just like a SOP. But then SOP is not just basic because it's going to depend on how it is written. Are we writing it so that anybody that comes out of school can read it and understand? So are we writing in a language that's easy? Are we using things like process maps that's easy to visualize so it's not overwhelming? So then you would have someone who came in, and although there's a procedure, it's more a deterrent. So they don't know what they should know. So the information sharing actually stopped at the first spot, SOP. So if we focus on how we write our procedures, that's just basic, but that's important. Training is another thing that's important, and it's important to make sure that people are properly trained and not to take things for granted or think that people are not, maybe you won't understand, so I won't share this information with you. Training is important, writing proper competencies to make sure that the knowledge is transferred, and competency basically is checking to make sure that whatever the person was trained to do, it's still retained. So these are just basic stuff. But then when you move to the next level, then it's moved to things like mentoring and guiding people to move in the direction to know a little bit more than just basic running the test, which is very important. But understanding what goes on behind that, like the QC and the quality and, certain calibration or CAP standard or why we do what we do, it's just really valuable. And, just giving, sometimes people would say, like, I don't think I need to know that. Or somebody would say to somebody, you don't need to worry yourself with that. That's not really what you should know. But we should be incentivizing people to know more and to grow more, because there's a lot of young people who get really disgruntled or get bored because they find themselves doing the same thing and they leave. So there's a gap not only with a lot of older people getting ready to leave the workforce, but there's a big challenge with a lot of young people leaving because they're bored and there's not enough opportunity. So, for me, I had an experience when I moved into my position. The person was in that position for over 40 years, and nobody cared to know what she did. So she did it on her own. It was basically in silo. So she left without any planning, and people were scrambling. There's a CAP inspection was coming up. People didn't know what to do. It was really a crazy experience. So when I took on that position, I allowed people to do a lot of projects, and that was very unusual. And people were looking at it as if this is your job. Why are you asking people to do your job? But I saw it more as empowering, and a lot of people were like looking forward to do these projects to know. People want to know more and people want to grow. And it's not only helping your team, it's helping your organization. So you have people who can answer questions when there's a phone call coming in. People can understand why, and people support things that they're asked to do because they understand why. And I could go on and on and on, but basically I would just say the strategy would be just basic strategy, just like having good SOPs, having good training, having a guide, a mentor, and coaching, and just not leave the work to just some special group or a special one person, but to spread the wealth. And then have incentive, career ladder, so that people could say, okay, if I do this, I could, for my organization, I have something we call the CLS4. So when they move up into, they know that doing projects there's an incentive behind it to grow and to learn. So
I really like.
Great.
I really like what you said about having incentive plans so people don't get bored, because it really to me, kind of starts with your culture, right? I mean, what was the culture of a person leaving, and then nobody really trying to understand what her day would feel like, so they could try to give you a roadmap of what to do next. And to me, that's the perpetual cycle we see in laboratories all over the place. Is we have these knowledge hoarders that, everybody knows that they are siloed and that they're doing stuff that's really important, but nobody really knows the total depth of what they're doing. And maybe themselves, they're not open to share, maybe because it's fear of losing your job or fear of being irrelevant or obsolete, and so they're not forthcoming with everything that they're doing in the day. But you got to change that culture, like you said, of making it empowering for everybody to understand all of the processes in the laboratory. And to me, those techs that are bored, maybe that'll help open their eyes to see the vastness of what really goes into maintaining compliance and maintaining regulatory standards in the laboratory, rather than them just knowing, my supervisor's over there filling out a bunch of papers and I don't know what they're doing. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I absolutely agree with that. And I think, I'm all about the practical as well. So I think we need to touch on mindset with knowledge, because, back in the day, it could have been, when you knew more, you were more valuable, and you felt like that, if something was to happen in an organization, because you knew that information, that you were safe. And that's not the way of the laboratory anymore, especially as laboratories are becoming systems, part of larger healthcare organizations. I've been a part of numerous organizations, and I've seen people with very little experience get separated from the organization, as well as people who've had 20, 30 years get separated from the organization. And so it really had nothing to do with just because you were the only one that knew that information. I think we need to change the culture and talk about it differently to make it okay and to make it safe to share information. And so in my role, I had walked into a role where somebody had been in that role for 30 years as well, just like Lona, and nobody really knew what that person did. They just kind of knew it all. They'd done it all, and they'd done a multitude of jobs across a multitude of disciplines. So they might have done stuff for chemistry, might have done stuff or made decisions for IT and quality and compliance. And, they were the end-all, be-all. And then at some point, as I always like to say, if the person wins $1 million or retires or go to the beach, that happened, and that person took their information with them because stuff was not documented, wasn't wrote down. And what happened is the people that was left behind were crippled because they really didn't know the why. Why are we doing what we're doing? It was just that such and such always did it. And with the knowledge sharing, it's actually twofold. So it's mindset, but it's also, too, of that, mindset of making it safe to share. I try to instill in any of the employees that I've had over the years of being in management and leadership that if you leave, what kind of legacy do you want to leave on the lab? So if you leave and win $1 million or retire, do you want it to be the people that's left behind or left trying to figure it out? Here you've been here for 10, 20, 30 years, and they are left clueless? Because that doesn't look good on your legacy. That doesn't look good on you as a tech that had been here for 40 years and you left your entire laboratory and your entire team crippled because they didn't have the information because you walked up out of here with it in your mind. So I try to empower the people who do have that specialized knowledge to leave that information behind because you are leaving a legacy. We all leave a legacy in every single position that we're in and every single role that we have. So anywhere I've ever worked, I left a legacy. So whether it was good or bad, the people learned from it or didn't, there was a legacy left behind when Tywauna Wilson departed that organization. And it's the same way for you all and the rest of the laboratorians. The other part of knowledge sharing, and this goes to the techs, the end users, is that once you know, now you have to be accountable to that information. And so sometimes, I'm not saying there's nobody that's listening on this podcast, but sometimes people don't want to know the information because then they have to be accountable and able to perform and carry out said tasks. So knowledge sharing is kind of a double-edged sword. It's a two-way street. So we do have to give that information, but once you have that information, then you have to do something with it as well. And so as we were getting ready for this topic, because I'm passionate about this, I done walked into many positions, and nothing was wrote down, nothing was there. And people say, well, that person has been here 20 years, or that person has been here 5 years, or whatever the case may be. And so I was looking up knowledge, and knowledge kind of fell into 3 buckets. You had like your general knowledge. General knowledge would be just the field of medical laboratory science as a whole, right? We're all medical laboratory professionals. You know, we have a same education that we need to go through in order to be certified. So general medical laboratory profession. Then you actually have your domain specific. So that might be somebody who's a medical laboratory scientist working in the state of Ohio. I'm using Ohio because that's where I'm at. Working in the state of Ohio as a generalist, right? I work in the state of Ohio up under the premise of medical laboratory science as a generalist in the state of Ohio. Then you start getting to your site specific. So now I'm working for doctor's lab in Cincinnati, Ohio as a generalist in the state of Ohio. Right, so now we have, you see how I have broken down knowledge, a generalist in the field of medical laboratory science, generalist in the state of Ohio, now a generalist for doctor's medical laboratory. And so me working at doctor's medical laboratory is going to be different than Lona working in Maryland, even if we're working in the same medical laboratory science as generalists on the same shift, right? And so it made me look at Tech A and Tech B. So if you have a Tech A and Tech B, they both have 5 years of experience working in a medical laboratory as a generalist on third shift. They've worked as a generalist on third shift for 5 years in a medical laboratory, the same, right? Tech A has worked at the same place for 5 years as a generalist on third shift. So that person is going to have all kind of information unique to working at place A for 5 years. They got to know that place inside and out. They have worked as a generalist. That could be in hematology and chemistry, maybe blood bank, maybe not. Then you got Tech B. Tech B, 5 years experience. All things is equal except they've had 3 employers. So they've worked in 3 different laboratories over 5 years. Same shift, worked as a generalist. But maybe at employer A, a generalist worked in hematology, chemistry, and blood bank. They worked there for 2 years. Then they went on to employer B. Employer B, a generalist was chemistry, hematology, and micro. Worked there for another 2 years. Then they went on to somewhere else as a generalist. It could be chemistry and hematology only. So now when you look at these 2 employees, you cannot tell me that they have the same knowledge, even though they both have 5 years of experience as generalists working in the medical laboratory on third shift, right? And so a lot of times we try to compare, well, this person has 5 years of experience. This person has 10 years of experience. We both have 5 years of experience, but it doesn't mean that my 5 years of experience at 3 places is better or worse than your 5 years of experience at 1 place. And what we have to get to, the reason why I gave you that example is what we have to get to as medical laboratory professionals in our laboratory is we have to know that we can learn something from everybody, right? So just because you have somebody that's new in your laboratory and they have, a few years of experience, don't think you can't learn something from them, right? Because, or if you're new in somebody in a laboratory and there's people that's been there for 5, 10, 20 years, don't think that you can't learn something from them. We have to do a better job of pairing talent, pairing skills together So not just a seasoned tech and a new tech. You may need to pair two techs with the same years of experience, because what they can bring to the table, their synergy together is probably going to be better together than as individuals. And that's where we don't do a good job. We don't do a good job of trying to do mentoring in that space. It's always, you have experience, you right out of school. You know, I can tell you that since I've been a tech in over 15 years, my experience is very different than somebody else who's been a tech for 15 years. I can tell you it's very different because I've been in positions outside of the laboratory that's given me a different lens than somebody who may have done their entire career at one particular place. What if the particular place that you've done your entire career, what if they are not up to date with their equipment and their processes? Then what? Then your 15 years of experience may be the same as somebody that has less experience who's been at places that had automation 10 years ago, that had online procedures 10 years ago, that had a new computer system 10 years ago, and your organization is just getting there. So we have to do a better job as laboratorians, as healthcare workers, of really transferring that knowledge, you know, across skill sets, across disciplines, across, you know, our techs that are seasoned versus those who are just entering the field, our techs that are new to our laboratory versus those who've been there for a while. And don't assume, you know, that, again, the reason I gave you that example of Tech A and Tech B having the same amount of experience, because here's a place where we mess up, and I've seen it, is that, well, she got 5 years of experience. She knows this stuff. Yes, she knows medical laboratory science. She doesn't know how you do it in your lab. So you have to train them on how you do it in your lab, because the last lab she was at might not have did it that way. And sometimes we, you know, when it comes to knowledge, we are not always looking at it from that kind of lens. We're not always looking at it from a global perspective. We're looking at it from, here I am right now, let me get this person trained into their shift, and not taking into account everything that the person can bring to the table.
Well, and I think when you have the number of vacancies we have, not just with technical but with management, you have to look at that if you're going into the management role also, because there's so many nuances of your job that aren't, you know, just on the job description. There are different things that, you know, you might have been tracking in your laboratory on an Excel spreadsheet that I track in my laboratory using a different software, or that I've built different things in Visio. And so knowing that we can learn and exchange information, because there's always something to improve. There are improvements that you might be making in your laboratory that I didn't think to look at. Does that need to be improved in my laboratory? And so I can learn from the process improvements that are going in your laboratory to my laboratory. I always hate to hear when people, you know, leave and then, you know, feel like because this person left, the laboratory kind of came into a struggle or came into a demise or suffered because of that. Because even if you're not a leader in your laboratory, if you're an informal leader in the laboratory, all of us should have the mindset that we want this team to succeed. We want this boat to still float even if you jump off the ship. And so the first priority should always be success for the whole, because success for the laboratory means success for the doctors and the nurses, which ultimately results in quality care for our patients. So what I would say to any listeners that are out there, if you're a leader or not, take the initiative to assess your laboratory, assess your workspace, identify, you know what, if Stephanie were to leave today, what would I lose? What am I gaining because she's here every day? But if, like Tywauna said, if she wins $1 million, I think for me it might take $2 million then, because I got a lot of bills. But if Stephanie wins a couple $1 million and she leaves, what are the things that would walk out the door with her? And then start there. Identify the areas where you have gaps and start assessing those gaps and start making a plan to chip away at them and making a plan to make sure that gap can be filled and that feeling can be sustained. If you're not a leader in your laboratory, bring that up to your supervisor or to your manager and say, you know what, I've identified a gap here. I've identified that my neighbor or myself or this person on the third shift is the only person who knows how to do X, Y, and Z. I think we should spread that out a little bit and take the initiative to bring those things forward.
Yes, Stephanie, and, I'm thinking about that we start with leadership in terms of making these changes. However, just as part of the team or just a staff member should not be afraid to bring these things up to leadership. There may be opportunities that people may want and they're afraid to ask for because they may say, well, I don't have 10 years of experience, or I don't have this amount of time working in chemistry, but there may be a lot of strengths that you have to bring to the table. Bring that up, because I've been in that position several years ago. I remember moving from overnight shift, and I thought of doing a specialist in hematology, and I started talking about it. Someone who's been there for how many years, who basically didn't actually move out of that position, been doing the same thing for a long time, and I don't know, for whatever reason, was not promoted, but requested to be promoted, told me there's no way you're going to come here and get this opportunity. I've had all these years working and toiling, and there's no way you're going to be able to work in special hematology, do special coag, and get this opportunity. And I allowed that to intimidate me. So don't be afraid to ask for what you need. I didn't ask because I was saying there are other people who have more seniority than I do, so might as well I just shut up. Somebody just intimidated me and said, I wanted this forever. But for whatever reason, they probably wouldn't have given it to that person. But don't even look around. If there's opportunity, if you need to grow, which we think we should always be looking for opportunities to grow, either identify something that you can do and go to your leader with a proposal and show them how that will help the lab. And we should think of how just knowledge sharing is really beneficial to the lab, not only to the lab, but to the hospital on a whole. It's actually empowering our team, it's empowering the lab, giving us the kind of knowledge that we need when we are having discussions with other healthcare teams, when we are working together on projects. We don't want to just have one person who we can send to work on a certain project. If we can empower our team, and then it's going to really reflect really well on our team when we can send someone else to another meeting here and there. So it's not about one person having all the knowledge. It's better to share. When you share knowledge, you're not losing it. You're actually multiplying it. So, I just like what Tywauna said, and Stephanie, I'm very passionate about knowledge sharing. I'm really passionate about empowering the team and not just empowering one or two people here and there, because you just never know. When you have an empowered team, you have more people to choose from when there's a career opportunity. You have more people to as a matter of fact, it's actually looking good as a leader when you have an empowered team. So I think we probably, Stephanie, I don't know if you have certain benefits that we could talk about just for knowledge sharing, how the lab on a whole can benefit.
Well, I think once you look at knowledge sharing as a whole, like we said, you come to empowering your teams, and that always brings different benefits like morale, like improved communication, and obviously you're increasing your ability to, streamline processes, to talk about procedures, to perfect procedures and revise procedures. Everyone has a really clear idea of all of the roles in the laboratory. And so I think that, puts people at ease, and it opens up, your ability to be transparent across your teams. To me, like I said before, if you've got that culture of sharing, and we've got this culture of transparency, and we've got this culture of openness, then we're able to really focus on the patient care aspect and not worry so much about, such and such has been here for 40 years. I hope she doesn't retire, because the team will see that we're continuously planning for those gaps. We don't want to be caught blindsided. We don't want to be caught in, a compliance detriment or regulatory detriment by somebody walking out the door. And then I would also say that if you are working in a laboratory where there is not a plan for filling knowledge gaps, and you don't see that, maybe when you go on an interview, you are interviewing that entity as much as they are interviewing you for that position. So maybe ask, as part of your interview questions when you're going for a new job, what is your succession planning? What is your plan to make sure that I am successful in this role? How will I understand all of the nuances of the person who preceded me? How can I be assured that you're going to assist me with being successful in this role? And, see what they say, see what their plan is. If they don't have a plan in place, I wouldn't be intimidated not to take the position. I would obviously want you to consider that in the totality of what you're looking at before you take the position, but maybe also think about putting that in place or implementing that in your roles.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with all of that. And then it just leads to a better work environment. The morale goes up because then you start to have that open communication. When information is shared across the laboratory and across people, then people start to feel as if they are part of the solution. They start to feel as if they are part of the team. They start to feel as if you care about who they are. And so I think once you start to put some of these things in place, as you have mentioned all of those other benefits, I think it just leads to better quality in the lab, positive workplace reputation. As the laboratory industry is very small, and as you know, laboratories are always talking. So you want to have it so that your lab, your system, is one that people are talking about in a positive way, that people will even want to work there. I mean, I can recall being in clinicals and people talking about different labs at the time, and there are people been there for a while and they don't listen to your ideas and those kind of things. And, that kind of stuck with me as I was thinking about which employer I wanted to go work for and things of those nature. So I think if we, make sure that we are doing a good job of trying to implement knowledge sharing, starting from the top, but it's not just starting from the top, is both top and frontline workers. We all should be sharing our knowledge. I think it'll lead to a better laboratory that people want to work for, people are proud to be a part of, people want to wear their shirts and stuff that has their employer's name out in the community. And I think it'll just be better for the next generation of laboratorians coming behind of wanting to work for certain organizations. So, yeah, that would be my closing remarks about the knowledge sharing. I think together we are better, always about collaboration, always about partnership. So share the information. It does not make you invaluable to share the information. It makes you more valuable.
Certainly, Tywauna. I think you ended it on a really great note in terms of us working together to be stronger together. So knowledge sharing is like teamwork, it's collaboration, it's building each other up and showing off ourselves as the best. And we are, like I always say, an important part of that whole, which is health system. And we have to build ourselves up to demonstrate that to the rest of healthcare and be able to contribute, to show our value, to contribute. And if we don't have an empowered team, we can't do so. So I really enjoyed this discussion today. I I think there are some really good discussion points, and hopefully the listeners will continue this discussion. Really want to thank everyone for tuning in and checking out this episode of Elaborate Topics with our hosts, Tywauna Wilson, Lona Small, and Stephanie Whitehead. So if you hear something today that you really enjoy, go on to Elaborate Topics at directimpactbroadcasting.com, and you'll see this episode coming up and other episodes that we've had, and you can put your comments or your input and continue the conversation. So you can also listen to this and other episodes on not just Impact Broadcasting, but your favorite podcast platform. So we really enjoyed sharing today. Until we talk again next week, have a great week.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Elaborate Topics, where your hosts discussed relevant strategies for laboratory professionals. Please subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform and listen to us on directimpactbroadcasting.com. Stay tuned for another episode with information you can use to excel in your laboratory career.